This is the war in Russia through the eyes of Otto Carius, one of Germany's most distinguished tank commanders. He is taking up new defensive positions on the river Narva. Let's begin. To make the following operations understandable, I have to discuss the layout of the defensive positions along the Narva as it was known to the battalion staff on February 24, 1944. The river presented itself as a defensive position. If one follows it upstream, it initially runs about 10 kilometers in a southeasterly direction from its mouth in the Bay of Finland. It flows past Rigi and Sievertsi and toward the city of Narva before turning south. After 1 or 2 kilometers, it curves to the west. This leg, where the Narva flows for almost 10 kilometers from east to west, will be important for the following narrative. Following this section, one then reaches the northeast corner of Lake Peipus after about 45 kilometers in a south-southeasterly direction. When we were withdrawn from Rigi, the front ran from the Bay of Narva, from Hungerberg to be exact, along the western bank of the river. It went via Rigi to just before Narva. It then jumped over to the eastern bank, where the bridgehead had been formed in front of the city. This bridgehead was necessary for holding the city. The front line met the Narva again where it made its bend. It had been intended to continue the line on the eastern bank. It had even been planned to build a bridgehead in the middle of the east-west leg that followed. As so often happened, however, the Russians put an end to our plans in that regard. The Narva-Waiwara-Wesenberg railway line ran parallel to this east-west axis of the Narva, about 8 kilometers to the north. Another 800 meters to the north was the Rolban. From there, it was another 5 to 6 kilometers to the Baltic coast. The area between the river and the Rolban was completely marshy. The railway went over a reinforced embankment. The infantry units, which were supposed to occupy the east-west axis in order to form the planned bridgehead to the south, arrived too late. One had assumed that the Russians had not yet advanced as far as the Narva in that area. Because of the marshy terrain, one also considered it unlikely that the Russians would establish themselves north of the river. According to the High Command, the marshy area was completely ill-suited for establishing a position. When our guys wanted to occupy their positions, however, they made the embarrassing discovery that Ivan had already pushed forward with strong forces between the northern bank of the Narva and the Rolban. He had established a bridgehead there from which he threatened our troops in Narva. Our units were too weak to force him back to the south over the river. As a result of all these difficulties, our front line took on a highly original character. It ran north of the railway embankment and consisted of strong points. At about the middle of this leg, however, it pushed into the enemy bridgehead on both sides of a trail. There it had the shape of a boot. The northern portion of the Russian-occupied terrain was thus split into 2 parts, the East Sack and the West Sack. Both of these sacks became standard terms in the Wehrmacht reports. The trail, which led out of the boot to the north, went through the village of Lembitu after crossing the railway. After about another 800 meters, it reached some high ground that jutted out of the somewhat flat terrain like a large molehill. Just behind it, the trail emptied into the main Rolban. This trail was crossed by a second one in Lembitu. It ran from the west parallel to the railroad and brushed past a farmhouse behind the edge of the village. From the farmhouse, it led diagonally to the railway embankment and reached a second railway crossing after about 130 meters. Along the leg from the farmhouse to the rail crossing, there were 2 additional houses located at approximately equidistant intervals. I wanted to preface my upcoming narration with this detailed description of the terrain so that the reader could form a mental picture of our operations in this area. The map provided in this chapter also gives additional information about the area where we fought it out with the Russians. When we returned from Rigi to the company trains, located about 25 kilometers west of Narva in an area between the coast and the Rolban, I immediately drove on to the battalion command post to report to the commander. He asked me to relieve our company commander at Lembitu that same day. He was not in the best of health. Our company was distributed among the individual infantry regiments. The company commander was at Lembitu with 2 Tigers. There were an additional 4 at the West Sack. Using a Kubelwagen, I immediately drove to Lembitu in order to relieve the commander. As I drove down the road from the Kinderheim, that was the name given to the high ground north of Lembitu, I noticed where the front line ran from the amount of combat activity. The commander was happy that I had come so quickly and immediately disappeared with my Kubel. Feldwebel Kircher was sitting in the second vehicle and served as its commander. We always got along well. Whenever both of us were together, I always felt better in an operation. My comrades explained the situation to me. According to them, the Russians were sitting behind the railway embankment and making themselves at home there. The embankment was so high that one could easily dig tunnels into it. These served as bunkers. Our men were in the farmhouse and in both of the houses between it and the Russian rail crossing. Our tanks were behind the farmhouse. At night, pairs of sentries had to maintain contact between the strong points. It had been decided against a trench system, as the regimental commander was of the opinion that the current lines were only temporary ones. His command post was located on the back slope of the Kinderheim. It fell off so sharply on the eastern side that they had dug tunnels into the mountain. They were thus safe from any type of fire. After the first night, I reached an agreement with the infantry commander that we should pull security during the day and his people at night. My men also needed to have a few hours of rest as long as it was possible. We laid a wire from the farmhouse to a house west of the road crossing in the village. I was thus always able to be in position whenever something was happening. On the first evening, of course, we did not drive back to our rest position. I wanted to take a look at the positions first. This was only possible during darkness. The infantrymen were quite surprised when I expressed my desire to get acquainted with the positions. Apparently they had never experienced that before, but I had my own ideas on that subject. How were we supposed to support people effectively when we really didn't know their positions inside and out? How was teamwork supposed to function if we didn't know one another better? For us tankers, positional warfare and any type of operation within the front lines was certainly nothing to shout about. We weren't born to hang around the countryside as large targets. Our missions were attack and counterattack, that is, operations on the move. But what were the poor guys there supposed to do without us? They were in a position that could not be held without tanks. I therefore went to the nearest house with the first pair of sentries. It was about 70 meters away. The route could not be seen by the Russians at night, as there were small trees and marsh vegetation between us and the railway embankment. The strong point had been occupied by a company, just like the farmhouse. One shouldn't be deceived by the word company, however. That meant 25 to 30 men. This imposing number had only been achieved because replacements from home had arrived shortly before. Raw recruits who still needed to learn about the front were sitting there. They were astonishingly willing and eager to see action. I went with the roving sentries from this strong point to the third one, only 30 to 40 meters from the railway embankment. There was no cover to the right, but the Russians behind the railway embankment appeared to be concerned with themselves. Only occasionally did a shot ring through the night and force us face down in the mud. Ivan probably only wanted to prove that he was still there. We were only a few meters away from the enemy in the most forward strong point. In general, the front was quiet. Only occasionally did a round from our artillery rustle close overhead through the air and explode on the other side of the railway embankment. Once in a while we heard the Russians call to one another and perceived sounds that made us assume that the construction of positions was in progress. The Russians had to fortify their dugouts just like we did and improve their roads to bring up heavy materiel. The next company was located another 150 to 200 meters farther on in the wood line, which extended between the railway embankment and the Rollbahn. This guard therefore had to cover the longest stretch. We then went to the man at the right contact point of the next battalion, which belonged to the Feldherrnhalle division. There, in the woods, a proper front line started. It ran along to the railway embankment heading east. The Russians had established their lines in another wood line 200 meters to the south. No foot soldier enjoyed having completely open terrain to his back. It doesn't offer any cover and makes it practically impossible in a difficult situation to bring up reserves without the enemy being able to observe and disturb every movement. Our infantry found itself in just such a complicated situation in these positions that made the necessity of our presence all the more obvious. If the Russians were to get the dumb idea to attack farther to the north, then our comrades could not have prevented a penetration without armor support. Our infantry was busily engaged in building up the strong points into bunkers. The basements were reinforced with beams, firing ports were added, and the duty stoker ensured that the guards could always warm up. Compared to them, those of us in the tanks were quite bad off in the winter whenever we had to pull security for days and weeks on end, as we did there. We would have been happy to have a little bit of the heat that prevailed in the tanks in the summer. In the winter, it was like sitting in an icebox. To warm us up a little bit once in a while, we had come up with the idea of burning a large petroleum lamp. While we were in training, it had been strictly forbidden to smoke in the tank, and there we were, allowing a petroleum lamp to burn at full throttle in front of the enemy. Thank God that an accident never occurred in any of the tanks of the company because of this carelessness. But there were other effects. For example, whenever all of us had dozed off and the pressure on the wick let up some, it began to smoke like there was no tomorrow. We all looked like chimney sweeps. Because of the soot, the inside of all of our tanks could scarcely be called white anymore. The air wasn't the best either. I am amazed today that none of us was poisoned from smoke inhalation. A standard phrase applied back then. Nobody has ever died from the stink, but a lot have from freezing. Even the rations in the tank tasted of gas or oil. With time and in a pinch, however, people get used to everything. This smell of gas and old oil, this tank smell, even became quite agreeable to us over the years. In the gray of morning, a young soldier came running to my vehicle. He reported that his people in the nearest strong point had observed the Russians emplacing the first AT gun in the railway embankment. Of course, I promised immediate countermeasures. An old truth, we had to show something to our infantry comrades to win their trust. If that was done, we could talk to them in a reasonable manner and not have to worry about dumb things happening. Then both of us boldly drove out to the second strong point and lined up against the railway embankment. The Russian anti-tank gun was difficult to identify because it had been camouflaged magnificently. Only the muzzle brake peeked out. Because Ivan still hadn't fired up to then, he missed his chance. After a few rounds, the barrel of the gun pointed skyward, looking like it could have been that of an anti-aircraft weapon. Even though we were scarcely 50 meters in front of the thing, it could not be finished off with a single round. Ivan had emplaced it very skillfully in the railway embankment. We first had to soften up the exterior. During this minor operation, I could finally take a look at the terrain during the day. Without a doubt, the Russians had the advantage over us. Behind the railway embankment were a few rows of high fir trees. The Russians were later able to dominate the entire terrain using sharpshooters from the peaks. Behind that, visible through the fir trees, was an open plain, which extended to the edge of a fairly tall set of woods in a marsh. The row of trees stopped at the railway crossing. The Russians had therefore let their front line move back at that point because the embankment became lower to the east and didn't offer enough cover. After our little morning excursion, we drove back to the farmhouse. At that time, we had no idea that we would have to continue this monotonous existence of pulling security for weeks on end. We had scarcely arrived into position behind the farmhouse when a Kubelwagen came racing down the road from the Kinderheim. Ivan could see this route without any problems and immediately began to pepper us with mortar rounds. Fortunately, he didn't hit the Kubel. Old man Bierman, a career non-commissioned officer, climbed out of it. He ran the forward supply point and wouldn't hear of not bringing us rations, even in the most impossible of situations. He drove right up to us and we were able to take our meal. I greeted him with a few choice words. "You put your life on the line for this lumpy chow. Have you gone crazy?" Bierman gave a short reply. "Don't forget, I also want my warm food and my coffee. But if you didn't have anything here up front, then how are we supposed to enjoy our meal?" That wasn't just dumb talk or idle bragging. His words came from the heart. Whenever there are shots fired in anger, all the idle bragging stops. It was that selfless comradeship and altruistic commitment that will never let us forget the difficult times at the front. It holds us together even today. Only when everyone has to show his true colors and substance counts, not a uniform or an external mask, does one really get to know a person. One can be sure that these comrades won't let one down in peacetime either. Granted, a war isn't exactly necessary in order to get to really know a person, but the experience of comradeship, this bonding to the others without regard for oneself, has convinced me that our time in the war had not been lost. Instead, it has given all of us something to take with us on the path of life. In my experience, the people who curse a blue streak about their army time and talk about stolen years were usually poor comrades and boundless egoists. Of course, old man Biermann was only old for us young bucks. He was probably in his mid-30s. He had a family and had been a member of the Social Democrats, a party that he still admitted belonging to. He never attempted to conceal his opinions, but that didn't stop him from becoming a non-commissioned officer. He was a tremendous soldier. None of us ever asked to see someone's party membership book. No one except for the first sergeant who kept the company rolls knew who belonged to what religion, who cared whether someone was from Saxony or from the Pfalz, from Berlin or from Austria. What counted was that he did his duty in the group and that we could depend on him. To the enemy, everyone was the same. The Russians didn't differentiate. On the other hand, whoever let us down at the front and couldn't get his act together was written off by his fellow soldiers. He had a hard time being accepted back into the community. It was with Biermann that I liked to talk to about our options after the war. We occasionally had the thought that we could lose it. We all had our fantasies. Life after the war would be so nice if everyone respected everyone else as we did in the company, without regard to party, religion, and occupation. The main thing was that everyone did his job the best way he could. We believed back then that such ideals could be realized in a democracy, but doubts also surfaced as to whether such ideal relationships allowed themselves to be created in the world at all. We later had to experience just how justified these doubts were. Old man Biermann liked to say, "The guy who sits at the feed trough gets to pig out, and if he is the only one who is pigging out, then everybody else can still be satisfied." He may well have hit the nail on the head with that. Following my little digression, let's return to the front at the Narva. Ivan continued to remain suspiciously quiet. Only when we allowed our engines to warm up for a quarter of an hour did he start to pepper us. He was probably assuming that we wanted to take off and stir up some trouble where he was. As soon as we heard the barn of the firing, we quickly buttoned our hatches. A few seconds later, the mortar rounds were hitting in our vicinity. Because the fuses were very sensitive, they made any type of penetration into the frozen earth impossible. The rounds only left black marks in the snow after impacting. Later on, with the 15 cm mortars, things became a whole lot more uncomfortable. The days passed by with dozing and freezing. In a comfortable civilian life, people have a hard time imagining how we could get used to the continuous cold. Despite it, we stripped off our old clothes twice a day to delouse ourselves. How thankful we would have been for a can of DDT powder. We hardly changed our underwear. Experience had taught us that our friendly rear-end roomers felt better in clean laundry. Therefore, the underwear had to be so dirty that even the lice were disgusted. Only then was their urge to reproduce somewhat dampened. Back then, I possessed 3 utensils that reminded me of my distant civilian life. First, there was a nail cleaner, highly valued by all of us. Then there was a comb, which also performed yeoman service. Finally, there was an old hairpin, which I used to clean my ears. It also circulated among the other comrades, and I was able to hold on to it throughout the war and prison camp. The subject of water was a sore one. Washing and even shaving were not high on the list of priorities. Naturally, the few wells had become frozen. The infantrymen didn't have it any better than we did, either. But foot soldiers know how to take care of themselves, even in the craziest of situations. Whenever meatballs arrived with the rations at night, we ate them with our hands. Our skin became visible under the soot and the dirt again. These things were of secondary importance to us anyway. We were all happy whenever we could sleep in a stretched-out position for at least a few hours during the night. We drove back to the western outskirts of the village on the second night. In one house, we found a bunker constructed under the floor. Even if we didn't have a stove in there, we could at least sleep in a stretched-out position in our winter clothing. Due to our exhaustion, we didn't notice the cold at all. The truck with the fuel, ammunition, and rations came at midnight. For the first time, we ate with a real appetite. During the day, we only forced something down reluctantly. Often, I wouldn't have eaten at all if my crew hadn't forced me to. The men simply did not let me light up a cigarette until I had finished my brie. My gunner, Unteroffizier Heinz Kramer, was extremely hard and unrelenting in this regard. It should be noted that we were extremely well fed given the circumstances. Our mess sergeant, Unteroffizier Pseidel, a barber by trade and from Vienna, spared no effort, even though he would have preferred to be in a tank again. He often provided us with dumplings and vegetables and avoided stews as much as possible. The men who brought rations, fuel, and munitions up front deserve special praise. They had a difficult and responsible mission. These resourceful men had to find us right behind the front and arrive in one piece. They always traveled at night, without lights and usually on unfamiliar routes, which were disrupted daily by new craters. Their mission was often more difficult than ours at the front. At least we were familiar with the local situation. They almost always had to count upon surprises. They were then expected to do the right thing based on their own initiative. Despite all that, we were never left without resupply. We were quite happy with our new night camp. The men in the lines could also be reassured. We had laid a field phone line from them to us. Shortly before daybreak, we would drive back to the farmhouse. There, someone usually came running to us to report what new things Ivan had done the previous night at the railway embankment. Occasionally, there were also some humorous episodes. Once in a while, we shot off the crowns of the trees on the other side of the railway embankment because they appeared suspicious. Ivan had sharpshooters in them. They breathed down our necks and prevented any type of free movement. During one such incident, a young infantryman who clearly hadn't been at the front very long came running out of breath to my tank. He excitedly explained that the Russians had posted armored sharpshooters in the trees. He had observed exactly how our machine gun ammo had bounced off them. He thought I really ought to be shooting in the trees with main gun rounds, and what had the well-meaning youth actually seen? The tracers of our rounds flew in all directions after contact with a branch. At the same time, however, the trajectory of the machine gun rounds was naturally quite different. Our comrade departed reassured. It should be noted, however, that he had only been a bit premature with the facts. Later, after penetrating the east sack, we were actually able to find body armor. It was worn primarily by the commissars and offered very nice protection against shrapnel and pistol rounds. In my opinion, though, this armor must have seriously impeded movement. My men had to get used to a lot of things and did it without complaining. There was one requirement, however, that they only begrudgingly got used to and complained about a lot. No one was allowed to relieve themselves during an operation or while pulling security. Personal relief had been ordered for the mornings and the evenings. If necessary, there was no other choice but to take care of business in the tank. With the passage of time, everyone got used to this rule, and there weren't any more problems. There was a reason for this harsh action. The majority of the men were lost when they were outside the tank. The Russians, who could observe their dismounting, immediately fired with rifles or mortars. Besides the senseless wounding of the men, there was the additional problem of getting equally good replacements from the home front. Because of my strict orders, we actually only had 2 more casualties outside of a tank, and these were with another Einsatzgruppe. Of course, as tank commanders, we had to get out once in a while to go to the infantry. The men didn't like that either. Whenever I wanted to climb out of the turret, Kramer often held me by the legs. He was afraid I might catch a round. On February 27th, bomber units paid their respects for the first time. From then on, these nuisances came every night, sometimes even twice in a night. They apparently wanted to prepare our positions for an assault. Shortly before the onset of darkness, the Pathfinder flew in from the south and dropped the familiar Christmas trees behind our lines. Immediately after that, 2-engine bombers appeared. They dropped their loads behind us on both sides of the Rollbahn. For the duration of the attack, Ivan fired red and pink flares toward us. They helped to orient the pilots so that they didn't drop bombs on their own lines. In addition, the Russians had stacked piles of wood behind the front line. These had the shape of a Soviet star and were ignited at the onset of darkness. Despite all of this, they sometimes dropped too short. In general, we didn't have anything to worry about right behind the front. In the following weeks, the Russians transformed the entire area on both sides of the Rollbahn from Narva to us into a moonscape. Because of the marshy land, the bombs burrowed deep into the earth before they blew up. They then scooped out high walls of earth. There were craters the size of single-family houses. They immediately filled up with water. We were well advised to take a close look at the terrain in the morning, so we didn't drive into them in case of action. What could happen will be reported in another section. Our flak only took the Pathfinder under fire because then the ammunition was gone. Unfortunately, they didn't always succeed in hitting it. Even though we felt safe to a certain extent, this whole business still didn't give us a warm and cozy feeling. Whenever those guys dropped their bombs, we had the feeling that they were rushing straight at us. This feeling lasted until they finally landed at a safe distance and made the soft earth tremble. In the tank, we thought we were standing on a spring mattress. Of course, we quickly set up our countermeasures. Whenever we saw the Pathfinder approach over the bridgehead in the evening, it was dubbed the Duty NCO because of its punctuality. We quickly moved back to our house in Lembatu. We did that so we weren't moving whenever the Christmas tree appeared in the heavens. This short move out of the danger zone wasn't a retreat. We drove toward the west and parallel to the front. We were then located in front of the so-called boot shaft. That is, we had Ivan right beside us. It was impossible for the bombers to hit us in the narrow boot. On the same evening, after our guests from the air had left us again, the division surgeon came to us riding in the resupply vehicle. He wanted to check out the health and welfare of the troops. No one was sick, but all of us had such swollen feet and legs that a few men had already cut open their boots somewhat to get relief. We couldn't take the things off since no one would have got them on again. It was at that point that the Honorable Division Surgeon appeared and examined our legs. He caused a laugh riot when he, in all seriousness, proposed that we should take foot baths in the evenings. We didn't even have water to wash our faces or a place to light a fire. It only would have betrayed us to the Russians. 2 of my people absolutely had to be sent to the rear, he said, because their feet were especially bad, but nothing could convince them to ride to the rear and be relieved. That was the spirit of our frontline comrades. Only the defective fantasy of a third-rate hack could dream up the fairy tale that a pistol had sometimes been necessary to force our subordinates into combat. This concludes the 8th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.